the Shrieking Hollow. Mark, Jess, and Eric had been planning their camping trip for months. They needed a break from their city lives, and Blackwater Hollow seemed like the perfect escape. It was remote, far off the beaten path, and known for its natural beauty. The internet had barely any mention of it, except for a few obscure blogs that detailed how to get there and some vague legends that the locals seemed to whisper about. Friday afternoon, the trio arrived at the trailhead. The air was cool and crisp, the sky a perfect shade of blue. Tall pines stretched high above them, their needles creating a soft carpet beneath their boots. As they hiked, they chatted about their plans, laughing and excited for a weekend without phones, work, or noise. After several hours of hiking, they reached Blackwater Hollow. It was a small clearing in the forest, with a shallow creek running along one side. The trees surrounded them in a tight circle, their branches thick and gnarled, almost forming a wall around the campsite. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. They set up camp, pitching their tents near the creek. Mark gathered firewood while Jess and Eric unpacked the food and gear. As the fire crackled to life, the smell of burning wood filled the air, and they settled in, eating dinner under the stars. The forest around them was calm, the only sounds being the gentle flow of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick mist began to roll in from the woods, slowly creeping toward their campsite. The forest, once alive with the sounds of insects and birds, had gone eerily silent. "Is it just me, or did it get a lot colder?" Jess asked, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Mark, sitting closest to the fire, frowned and poked at the flames. "It's just the woods. It gets chilly at night." Eric, however, was more uneasy. "I don't like how quiet it's gotten. You'd think we'd still hear something: an owl, crickets, anything." The uneasy silence stretched on as they tried to shake off the strange feeling, telling stories and forcing laughter around the fire. But just when they were beginning to relax, Jess froze, staring into the trees. "Do you guys see that?" she whispered. Mark and Eric followed her gaze, peering into the dense woods beyond the edge of their firelight. At first, they saw nothing but the thick mist swirling between the trees. Then, a shape moved slowly, unnaturally through the fog. It was tall, its limbs jerking as it moved, too distant to make out clearly but wrong enough to send chills through them. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, his voice tight with fear. "It's probably just a deer or something," Eric offered, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. The figure stopped moving for a moment, seeming to watch them from the shadows. Then, it slipped deeper into the trees, disappearing into the mist. They didn't talk about it much after that, but none of them slept well that night. Jess was certain she could hear strange sounds, faint whispers or cries carried on the wind. But each time she opened her eyes, the camp was still, the fire casting flickering shadows across the trees. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination or something else entirely. The next morning, they tried to shake off the events of the previous night. After breakfast, they decided to explore the area, hoping to take their minds off the strange feeling that clung to the campsite. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they stumbled upon something unexpected: a small, dilapidated shack, hidden behind a thick curtain of vines and moss. The shack looked ancient. Its roof was sagging, the wood rotting and dark with age. The door hung loosely on rusted hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. None of them spoke as they approached, the silence heavy between them. Jess was the first to step closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "This doesn't look like it's been touched in years." Mark peered through the cracked window. "What's a shack doing all the way out here?" Without waiting for an answer, Jess pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, revealing a small, dark room inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Broken furniture littered the floor, and strange symbols had been carved into the wooden wall: circles, crosses, and what looked like a crude, glaring eye. Eric shuddered as he looked around. "This place gives me the creeps. We should go." But before they could leave, Jess spotted something half buried in the dust on the floor: an old leather-bound journal. She picked it up, wiping away the grime. The cover was worn, but the pages inside were mostly intact, though yellowed with age. As she flipped through the pages, she found a series of strange, desperate entries. May 17th, 1896. We hear them at night, the shrieks. First distant, now close. Too close. They're coming for us. May 18th, 1896. The hollow is cursed. Those who stay here will never leave. The last entry was barely legible, smeared as if written in haste, but one word stood out: Watcher. Jess's hands trembled as she read it aloud to the others. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Back at camp, the feeling of being watched had intensified. The air seemed colder, the mist even thicker than before. As darkness fell, the strange wailing sounds returned, louder and closer than the previous night. The fire cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own, and the three friends huddled together, terrified. Suddenly, Eric stood up. "We can't stay here. We have to go. Now." But before they could gather their things, the wails grew deafening. From the mist, they saw the tall figure from the night before. It stood at the edge of the trees, watching them with hollow, glowing eyes. Its body was grotesque, long and twisted, its limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions as it stepped closer. Panic gripped them. Eric broke into a run, sprinting blindly into the woods, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he disappeared into the mist. Mark and Jess shouted for him to stop, but it was no use. Moments later, his scream echoed through the trees, a horrible, gut-wrenching sound that twisted into something inhuman. The figure stepped closer, and the wailing grew louder. Mark and Jess stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. They knew they couldn't outrun it. They couldn't hide. The Watcher of Blackwater Hollow had found them. The mist closed in, swallowing the camp, the fire, and the last of their hope.